In early 1932, Albert Einstein was ensconced in Pasadena, California, at the California Institute of Technology, that university that George Ellery Hale had built from a small technical and trade school into a scientific powerhouse. It was Einstein's third trip to the United States, and at this point, he was academia's biggest free agent. While no one knew it, he had resolved not to return to Germany, at least for some time, and perhaps not at all. Moreover, he was resolved also to renounce his position with the Prussian Academy of Sciences. All anyone knew was that the revered figure was looking for a place to split his time. While his scientific output had begun to decline, there were still a number of suitors for his services. Having a Nobel Prize on the faculty attracted other talented academicians as well as students, not to mention wealthy donors and grant funders. There was, of course, among those suitors, Caltech, now led by Albert Millikan, who had won his own Nobel for confirming Einstein's law of the photoelectric effect, the third prize given for that somewhat obscure physical phenomenon. In addition, Oxford was interested in bringing him in as a way to make up some of the ground the team around Rutherford at Cambridge had sort of gained, and there were universities in Holland and Belgium that had a rich tradition of supporting theoretical physics. What none of these august institutions saw was a new thing emerging in America. That new thing was the idea of Abraham Flexner, who had been instrumental in using the Rockefeller Foundation to move the typical American institution of higher education from the four-year liberal arts college-based model that sort of was founded on the English way of doing things to something closer to the German universities with research-driven graduate schools. Flexner was looking to create an independent institute for advanced studies where scholars in a limited number of areas could come together and work free of distractions associated with teaching and administrative responsibilities in order to pursue the creation of new knowledge. Flexner had come to Caltech to talk with Millikan about his ideas, and Millikan had suggested he chat with Einstein about what he might think. It would be a recommendation Millikan would come to regret. For while Millikan and Einstein differed on politics and social issues, Caltech's leader was sure he could convince his esteemed colleague that Pasadena, with its short but rich history of observational astrophysics and cosmology, was the right place for him to work. As Einstein and Flexner walked the gardens of the university and ideas flowed between the two men, Flexner recognized that Einstein would be the perfect person to make as one of the institution's first hires. While the timing wasn't right to make an offer, he promised Einstein that he would contact him in Europe at a later date to continue the conversation. When, 6 months later, that meeting happened, this time in Kaputhe, where Einstein was planning his escape from the rising tide of Nazism, Flexner made his offer and Einstein accepted. To Millikan's chagrin, Einstein would only make one more trip to Caltech, and that would be in January of 1933, before settling in Princeton, New Jersey, at the Institute, at what would be both his academic and official home for the rest of his life. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a mini-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 50.10, Supplemental. Albert Einstein, Politics and Exile. In this episode of our series on the life of Albert Einstein, I like to focus on his politics during the interwar years, from about 1919 up to the mid-1930s, as this, in a sense, will become the most significant aspect of his life as he grows older and moves away from the center of productive research in physics. This is not to say that his contributions to science completely ceased during this period. As we've already mentioned, his work with Bosch will be the foundation in understanding the behavior of specific types of quantum systems, but rather to recognize that as Europe tried to recover from the First World War and, to a degree, failed to come to a resolution of the issues of nationalism and the rise of ideological politics, and then as the international community tried to grapple with the slide back towards war, Einstein's voice, amplified by his celebrity and fame, became, I should say, a tremendously important one, even if it was often marginalized or ignored by those in the political sphere. And before we jump completely into this aspect of his life, let me just say a bit more about his scientific contributions during the period of the 1930s when he has already fled Germany for America. During that period, there will be no more groundbreaking or revolutionary research, but that doesn't mean there aren't really good contributions that he has made. The best known of these had to do with his ongoing discomfort with quantum theory. During this period, he'll collaborate with a number of other physicists to put forward thought experiments that called into question the Copenhagen interpretation, including his ongoing correspondence with Bohr, collaborating with Schrödinger to come up with the famous cat-in-the-box thought experiment, and offering up what is known as the EPR paradox. All of these would become the basis for any number of experimental tests of quantum theory that, at least to date, have continued to confirm the predictions made by the Copenhagen group. And just to be clear, we will cover these in greater detail in our next episode. I think that what we should take from this is that Einstein's unwillingness to just accept the claims of Bohr and his colleagues led to a more rigorous testing of quantum mechanics and quantum systems that has given us a greater insight into what is meant by that particular interpretation, and it also set the stage for a process of continuing verification that has continued up until the modern day. In this way, Einstein's skepticism, as I usually think is the case for good scientific skepticism, was a disposition that moved physics forward as opposed to holding it back, as has often been portrayed. Another interesting paper Einstein wrote during this period was one suggested by a colleague during his time at Princeton after 1930. The idea that was suggested to him was that since very massive objects will warp space-time significantly, and thus bend the paths of light that pass nearby, the massive object should be able to act as a lens of sorts for that light coming from an object farther away. The idea here is to imagine that you have a compact object. In Einstein's time, it would likely have been a white dwarf stellar remnant, but now we tend to think of things like black holes that sits between an observer here on Earth and a light-producing star that's further away from the observer than that dense object. Now, that star is going to send off light in all directions, including in ways that go just past the compact object, not actually hitting it, but traveling just through that warped space-time nearby. Now, that warped space-time will bend the light from that more distant object in ways that will be determined by the physical characteristics of the objects and sort of focus the light, much like a lens in a magnifying glass might. This process will produce certain images that will have unique characteristics that can be detected by our earthbound observer. In 1936, Einstein decided, for the sake of his friendship with another investigator, to do the calculations for this phenomena and submit it to a journal as sort of a favor. He didn't really think much of the exercise other than it was sort of a straightforward application. But in the last 30 years, the phenomenon of gravitational lensing, as it is now called, has not only been directly observed, but has become a profound and powerful tool in astrophysics. It was gravitational lensing that produced the best direct evidence for the existence of black holes. And the technique of observing what is known as microlensing has become a powerful tool in probing the nature and distribution of mass in the universe. So while Einstein's influence during the late 20s and into the 30s was shifting from being predominantly scientific to becoming more social and political, his mind was still producing ideas that for most physicists would have amounted to a very respectable career. It's just that, compared to his previous contributions, they seem just a little bit mundane. Nothing wrong with them, just not quite that stellar, if you'll pardon the pun, kind of work that he was so well known for by that time. In many ways, Einstein's scientific output during this period can be favorably compared to that of, say, J. Robert Oppenheimer, in that they tend to nibble around the edges of more fundamental work in ways that are both deeply insightful and useful, but don't contribute much to resolving the fundamental issues at the heart of the various theories. With that having been said, let's pivot now to Einstein's political and social views and how he expressed them. Now, as we get into this discussion, let me make a few broad introductory comments. The first is that what we're going to do here is try to present Einstein's views and ideas in as clear a way as possible as they form, develop, and change. Please understand that this isn't necessarily an endorsement of those ideas. There may be some of these ideas that you find that you disagree with, perhaps very strongly, but please don't equate our presentation of them with an endorsement. While I will have some things where I share my opinions and views later on, I do want to separate those from what Einstein says. However, with that having been said, it should be recognized that in many cases, Einstein's views have, over time, become significantly more mainstream, and even in those cases where they are not, it is pretty clear that he's, on the right side of history, as the saying goes. On other matters, it will be very clear that his naivete will give way to the reality of living in a world filled with very real and fallible people. The second point to make here, I think, is to recognize that Einstein was never a person who would have to put his ideas into direct action, as it were. He was never a politician or a public official who could make or implement policy. Rather, he is what can be thought of as sort of a public intellectual, something of maybe a dying breed in many respects these days. Through much of the period from the Enlightenment onwards, there have been those individuals who have entered into the public square, as one might call it, to put forward their views on how a better society could be achieved. Sometimes these figures were political, but often they were individuals who had shown that they had a keen intellect and had considered the various circumstances of their day and had come away with ideas to make for a better society in which human could, to use that most enlightened of terms, flourish. These might be philosophers, writers, scientists, and even those from more humble professions who had found the time to read and educate themselves on the issues and ideas of the day. These individuals would then make or be given opportunities to express their views on things either as original thoughts or as responses to the expressed views of others in such a way that those who were interested could hear their thoughts and consider them, either through newspaper editorials or thought pieces, speeches given to various organizations, or by the publications of pamphlets or books. Einstein, especially after his rise to fame and celebrity, mostly fits into this sort of public intellectual category. While he would have some opportunities to participate in or lead various policy-making efforts on a few scientific committees, especially associated with the League of Nations, he would mostly be influential through his tours and his pieces that he wrote for various publications, whether those be newspapers or organizational newsletters of various types. In the case of his written work, it was common for these pieces to be disseminated beyond their immediately intended audience into a broader conversation, something it seems that Einstein was a bit slow to learn at first, but that became in time something he well understood. Finally, as we've discussed in previous episodes, much of the foundation of Einstein's political and social worldview was formed during that 18 or so month period he spent in Aarau, Switzerland with Jost Wendler and his family before going to university in Zurich. As we discussed, Wendler's views were broadly international, socialist, and democratic in nature. In other words, they rejected nationalism as a positive force, embraced the idea that citizens had the right to have a hand in their own political representation and determination, and that some of the resources of a society should be pooled together to provide for the less fortunate in that society as a way to alleviate poverty and allow for a certain amount of social mobility. To this was added the idea of individual dignity and responsibility that tended to move Einstein away from militarism towards pacifism. During the period between 1896, when he began at the Polytechnic, and 1914, when he moved to Berlin, Einstein would have continued his consideration of these ideas in mostly hypothetical ways, as he was never active in any sense politically. He read the various ideas of philosophers and discussed them with mostly like-minded people in various salons he attended and with his students, but he was never really required to confront them head-on beyond the observations of what he saw as corrosive German militarism or the simultaneously arrogant and servile attitude he observed amongst the citizens of Prague during his time there. It wasn't until the failure of European diplomacy and the outbreak of hostilities in 1914 that he was forced to really look at the practical consequences of one set of ideas or another. I think that, for Einstein, if he had had one place he wanted to live based on his political and social ideas, it would likely have been Switzerland. But the prestige of the Prussian Academy and the excitement of a new relationship with Elsa had lured him to Berlin. Had the war not broken out, this would likely have been a good enough place, given the perfect job, intellectual companionship, and presence of a lover. But once hostilities broke out, he remembered all of the reasons he had renounced his German citizenship way back when in the first place. Once the war ended, though, he worked with more political figures to create political and social systems that were in line with those broad principles he learned in the Winteler home. Like many others, especially in Berlin, he pushed for a democratic government to stand against the rising tide of communism, as is illustrated by the incident with the university student collective that had arrested some of the university's administrators. In the realm of social justice issues, it should be noted that Germany under the Kaiser already had a number of what might be thought of as social safety net programs, including universal health care and things for the elderly and poverty-stricken. As such, Einstein's goals were to extend and expand these in such a way that was consistent with the democratic principles he held. Finally, in terms of his commitment to internationalism, while he had little influence over any political process or outcome on the European stage, he worked on a number of scientific fronts to promote the reintegration of Germany into various scientific societies. Unfortunately, this is where the manifesto of the 93 turned out to be so pernicious. For most of the countries outside the Central Axis powers, Germany's actions during the war, even more than those of the now collapsed Austro-Hungarian Empire, were seen as really being deserving of punishment. The destruction of libraries and scientific institutions in Belgium, the self-serving justification of the majority of the German scientific community as expressed in the manifesto, and the use of mustard gases and nerve agents in contravention of international law made it nearly impossible for Einstein to quickly effect the reintegration he had hoped for. In fact, it was only due to his willingness to associate his name with the Manifesto to the Europeans, that counter-document to the Manifesto of the 93, as well as his Swiss citizenship, that, for a number of years, allowed Einstein to have any significant interaction with his colleagues in what might be thought of as Allied or Entente countries. This, however, would prove to be a double-edged sword. While I'll leave it to the political historians to parse out the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, I think that there's a pretty broad consensus among scholars that the terms of the treaty, whether they were justified or not based on previous practice, laid the groundwork for what would unfold in Germany over the next 25 years. In signing the treaty, the Weimar government, the democracy Einstein and so many other intellectuals had thought was the best replacement for the imperial system that had gotten them into the war that could not be won, had tied itself not only to Germany's humiliation and defeat, but also the crushing terms the treaty imposed. Perhaps had the Republic managed to get its feet under it, rebuild its industrial capacity further east, and not had a worldwide depression cripple its economy, it might have been able to withstand the forces of the German right. Unfortunately, none of those things really happened. As the Weimar Republic got off to a shaky start, but a start nonetheless, Einstein's political focus shifted from working to establish democracy in Germany to trying to rid Europe of war. As we have mentioned, He saw the Great War as a monumental waste of lives, culture, and human potential for what had been little or no gain. In this, he was not alone, of course, but unlike many of his countrymen, who either blamed an older generation who had been unable to keep up with the times, as was the case for young intellectuals like Heisenberg, or treasonous and duplicitous forces within German society, as was the case with the various right-wing movements that arose not long after communism had been beaten back. Einstein thought that it was an inherent property of men, and by men he meant both the species and gender, to seek out conflict and violence, unless restrained by systems and institutions designed and empowered to disarm the great powers if possible, and, failing that, stand up to those governments that chose to use violence to achieve political ends. So what I'd like to do now is break down each of Einstein's causes, as it were, and then bring them back together in order to understand how they will be perceived in Germany and what the result will be. Let's start with the idea of pacifism. As we said, for Einstein, beginning in the mid-20s and through 1932, this was not something to be done with half measures or by sort of tweaking things around the edges. For him, the only solution was really complete demilitarization. In this attitude, he found himself completely disgusted by the dithering, as he saw it, that was going on in the League of Nations. When the body took up a proposal to limit the use of gas and nerve agents in warfare in 1928, he wrote, quote, "It seems to me an utterly futile task to prescribe rules and limitations for the conduct of war. War is not a game. Hence, one cannot wage war by rules as one would in playing games. Our fight must be against war itself. The masses of people can most effectively fight the institution of war by establishing an organization for the absolute refusal of military service." End quote. There are two things I want to note here before going on. First, in this story, we can see the gulf between what the great powers of Europe and the pacifist movement Einstein was a part of was experiencing. The conference was not on, outlawing the use of gas or nerve agents, just limiting them. Einstein understood that after the Great War, there would be no going back to some sort of limited warfare as had been the case throughout much of the 1800s following the Napoleonic era. While I don't think Einstein looked into the examples of the American Civil War or the Russo-Japanese War, the Great War, for him at least, had made it clear that from that point onwards in history, there would only be total war, fought with methods and machines that would annihilate entire generations of men. For the politicians of Europe who were negotiating these treaties, they were still living in a paradigm formed by things like the Crimean or the Franco-Prussian Wars, where engagements might actually be limited. The key thing to recognize is that for them, warfare was still thought to be a means of diplomacy to a degree, while for men like Einstein, war's lethality had rendered it an evil so profoundly devastating that it could no longer be used for any means whatsoever. In 1932, even as Hitler's rise to power was nearly complete, Einstein traveled to a League of Nations conference on disarmament. It was really a big deal because two of the great powers that had not joined the League, the United States and the Soviet Union, had agreed to attend, and there was real hope that something could get done. Einstein, who had sort of been one of the big pushers and organizers of the conference actually, wrote a piece for The Nation in which he said that the conference, quote, "will be decisive for the fate of the present generation and the one to come," end quote. In the article, he called for more than just a surrender of arms, but also a surrender of a certain amount of national sovereignty. Quote, "Mere agreements to arms or to limit armaments confer no protection," he argued. He also called for an international body empowered to arbitrate disputes and enforce the peace. Quote, "Compulsory arbitration must be supported by an executive force," end quote. Unfortunately, at least in the eyes of the pacifists, the conference was more of what we might call an arms limitation treaty, much like those of the 1980s and 1990s between the United States and Soviet Union on nuclear weapons. Due to the large number of attendees and their competing interests, the talks soon bogged down in the minutiae of trying to figure out how much different weapon systems counted, i.e., was an aircraft carrier worth the same as a battleship or more or less in terms of calculating some country's offensive capability. In fact, it was during just this kind of a debate that Einstein showed up in Geneva and attended a session of the negotiations, and it's here that one of the most amazing things took place, at least in my mind. When he arrived in the gallery of the meeting hall, the negotiations were stopped, and the assembled dignitaries and diplomats rose to give him a standing ovation, recognizing his work not only as a scientist, but also as an advocate for peace. They then returned to their bickering over just how much offensive strength each nation could have and how much of each type of ship in a navy could count. Einstein, dismayed at the direction things had taken, retired from the gallery and returned to his hotel, where he called a news conference, one that was very well attended by the very journalists who were supposed to be covering the disarmament conference. At it he said, quote, "One does not make war less likely to occur by formulating rules of warfare. We should be standing on rooftops, all of us, and denouncing this conference as a travesty," end quote. He then went on to castigate the diplomats for their attempts to, as he put it, humanize war, calling the entire thing a farce. Now, as a way to understand Einstein's standing in the world, let's pause here for just a moment and consider what he did in what might be more modern terms. Imagine that at the United Nations today there was a conference on something that threatened global stability. Maybe nuclear weapons proliferation, maybe climate change, maybe, oil resources or water resources, maybe weaponizing space. You kind of get the picture. Some really big thing that a lot of people have to agree on, or there really could be problems. The negotiations are bogging down and not really getting anywhere as different countries and their interests haggle over various things that really miss the point that something big needs to be done, and needs to be done soon in a way that requires that nations set aside their little concerns and commit to a broad and effective framework in which, to work with. Now, into this milieu steps some famous scientists, maybe someone like, Neil deGrasse Tyson in the United States or Brian Greene from the UK. You pick somebody. And the whole thing just sort of grinds to a halt to recognize their work both professionally and in science communication. And then they, angry that more isn't getting done, they return to their hotel there in New York City and they call a press conference that everybody attends, and their comments make international news. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't think of any figure in the world of science today that would have that much juice, so to speak. That's what we're talking about Einstein doing here, and it gives you a sense of just how big a figure he was in that period, right around 1930, that he could do that, and that, his comments would be carried in every major international newspaper. It's just quite amazing. So back to Einstein. What's interesting here is that he doesn't just call for governments to seek to outlaw weapons and war in the search for peace. He also calls for civil disobedience in the face of what he saw as an unjust and inhumane practice. One of the things I try to do when it comes to those who went through World War I is to imagine what it would have been like for them to have lived through the conflict that consumes so many lives and then come out the other side, and what it would have done to the worldview. For Einstein, the years in Berlin had to have been super depressing, as winter after winter, young men that would have headed into universities were called into service on the front lines, that if they returned from them at all, it would have been as maimed either physically or mentally or both. And for what? For so long during that war, it was just for a few hundred yards here or there, or, when a breakthrough actually did occur through the, other side's trenches, that ground that was gained there, maybe a few miles, would be lost in a few weeks with enormous casualties. So, for men like Einstein, I think, to object to the type of warfare that wasted human lives so prodigiously was really the only moral act they could take. And so he joined in what was known as the 2% movement. This was a pacifist initiative that called for 2% of the people of a nation's fighting age population just to refuse to serve if war broke out. In a speech he gave to the New History Society in New York City in 1930, he said, quote, "The timid might say, 'What's the use? We shall be sent to prison.' To them I would reply, even if only 2% of those assigned to perform military service should announce their refusal to fight, Governments would be powerless. They would not dare send such a large number of people to jail. End quote. So influential was this call to civil disobedience that those who supported the movement began wearing buttons with just a simple 2% displayed, indicating that they would be among those who would not fight. In that same year, he would join other noted pacifists such as Sigmund Freud, John Dewey, Upton Sinclair, and H.G. Wells in publishing a manifesto regarding youth education that said, quote, "We believe that anybody who sincerely wants peace should demand the abolition of military training for youth. Military training is the education of the mind and body in the technique of killing. It thwarts the growth of man's will for peace." End quote. As he would say of himself, it is clear that Einstein was that most intriguing of oxymorons, the militant pacifist, a position he would hold until the events in 1933 caused him to reconsider his views somewhat. Of course, what no one realized, and this is what would cause the changes in 1933, and Einstein's included in this during this period around 1930, is that they're debating mining rights in outer space while the asteroid is silently hurtling towards Earth. In less than a year of these comments in 1932, Adolf Hitler would be named the Chancellor of Germany, and Einstein would begin to change his calls for disarmament. Now, to go along with his call for disarmament, there was a question, or is the question, of his views on politics. While it's pretty clear that Einstein was a committed socialist in his economic views, the idea advanced by many of his detractors that he was a communist is really patently false. As his visibility in the pacifist community grew, he was pressed by a number of individuals to lend his name to various socialist organizations and causes. Unlike with the pacifist movement, however, he declined because, as he saw it, rightly in almost every instance, most of the socialist movements of the time were aligned with the Soviet Union and the totalitarian regime of Stalin. While Einstein found much in Soviet Russia to admire, most notably the loss of class structure, something still strong in much of Western Europe at that time, and the idea that every individual had the same inherent value, he could never go along with the idea that the state should be able to restrict human freedom or suppress rights for some supposed greater good. As was the case in 1919 with the university students, Einstein could not abide by anything that restricted human freedom. In today's political terms, Einstein should probably be seen as a social democrat, probably along the lines of the forms practiced in many of the Scandinavian governments. Einstein stated his views, or his political views, I should say, succinctly when he wrote, quote, "I believe that the most important mission of the state is to protect the individual and to make it possible for him to develop into a creative personality," end quote. Thus, as a part of his political and economic views, he embraced a strong sense of social justice. In his comments in various venues, he spared no institution from challenge or criticism. For example, in a speech to students at Caltech, he observed that he didn't believe that science had yet reached the point where it had done humanity more good than harm. While it had obviously done great things, it was also responsible for some of the worst horrors the world had known through its application in technologies of destruction. Beyond this, however, he was concerned that technology would become a means to, in a sense, enslave workers in meaningless and joyless jobs. As such, he exhorted the students there to, quote, "Never forget this when you are pondering over your diagrams and equations," end quote. On that same trip to the United States, he took up the cause of the Scottsboro Boys, a group of young African-American men who had been convicted of gang raping 2 white women in Alabama. While I won't go into the details of the case here, there's something you can look up if you'd like, the trials were kind of a classic case of a Jim Crow rigged justice system in the segregated South, and it had a number of appeals that reached the U.S. Supreme Court on multiple occasions. Einstein commented on what he perceived as the miscarriage of justice in the case to various newspapers and reporters as he traveled across the United States. Even in his support of the Zionist cause, Einstein was a strong advocate that whatever process and solution was arrived at for a Jewish homeland, if that process was to involve a resettlement in Palestine or some other portion of the Middle East, then representatives of the Arab populations should be included in the discussions in meaningful ways. Here I'd like to quote Walter Isaacson's biography on Einstein's thoughts, as I think it encapsulates his thinking rather well. Isaacson writes, quote, "His message was a prophetic one." Here's a quote from Einstein. "Should we be unable to find a way to honest cooperation and honest pacts with the Arabs," he wrote to Chaim Weizmann in 1926, and here Isaacson is referring to the influential leader of the World Zionist movement, "then we have learned absolutely nothing during our 2,000 years of suffering." And that's the end of Einstein's quote. So back to what Isaacson writes, he proposed both to Weizmann and in an open letter to an Arab that a privy council of 4 Jews and 4 Arabs, all independent-minded, be set up to resolve any disputes. Einstein wrote to Weizmann, quote, "The 2 great Semitic peoples have a common future," end quote. If the Jews did not assure that both sides lived in harmony, he warned friends in the Zionist movement the struggle would haunt them for decades to come, end quote. So now coming back to sort of an overview of that, or a commentary on that. In both his pacifist and his political views, Einstein was labeled by many as being really rather naive. It was and continues to be said that he lived in sort of an ideal world of the mind that sort of resembled parts of the real world, maybe even sort of a desired ideal real world, but didn't much apply to the world as it actually is. And I have a couple of thoughts on that, if I might be allowed to opine a bit here. First, if that criticism is true, I think it's excusable from a person who is a theoretical physicist, or any sort of theoretical scientist, to be quite honest. Einstein dealt in idealized systems that often didn't look much like real systems. However, even with that being said, as a theorist, he searched for principles that would accurately lead to a better understanding of the world and thus guide application. It is in this way that perhaps we can understand his positions and attitudes about a lot of these topics. The quote on the role of the state in the life of the individual illustrates this well, I think. It is one I think that both conservatives and liberals, and almost anyone of any political persuasion, can agree with. What Einstein saw was that many of the institutions of his time were not living up to this idea of, working for the good of the individual, but instead seeking things like power, control, and domination for privileged groups. In part, his specific examples and solutions were to point out these gaps, and when the situation changed, as it was about to do in Germany, his specific applications would change as well. Second, what I think should be noted in many of these cases where people called he or his ideas naive, it really turned out that Einstein was very much on the right side of history. The justice system in the 1920s and 1930s in the southern part of the U.S. was profoundly skewed against African Americans, a claim that might still be made today. The Middle Eastern solution probably would have gotten a whole lot better had the Palestinians been more involved from the outset in seeking a solution for that region. The arms limitations talks would have been a lot more effective had the nations that participated been seeking to find a true path to peace rather than finding a way to limit their opponent's offensive strength. This is not to say that Einstein didn't get some things wrong, as we'll discuss shortly, but rather that his idealism did show the path forward based on the principles of liberalism broadly defined. Just because some of his positions were, as podcaster Dan Carlin likes to put it, rainbows and unicorns, doesn't mean that they weren't the right way to proceed. Third, Einstein's views were rooted in the belief in the inherent goodness of people seeking to pursue their dreams. He believed very strongly in individual freedom and dignity in a way many in Europe found hard to understand. Whereas many of his countrymen and others around Europe were proclaiming that the individual should serve the state or some sort of an ideology, Einstein thought that to be backwards. His view of the rise of fascism was that it was only the persistent want of individuals that gave such nationalistic and totalitarian movements their power. To Einstein, the bundling of individuals into collective sheaths to serve a single man or party was anathema, whether it be communist or fascist. As Thomas Bucky, a lifelong friend of Einstein's and the son of his doctor, beginning, there in the 1920s, would later write, quote, Einstein was a humanist, socialist, and a Democrat. He was completely anti-totalitarian, no matter whether it was Russian, German, or South American. He approved of a combination of capitalism and socialism, and he hated all dictatorships of the right or left, end quote. This position, as the German Weimar Republic struggled to find its economic footing and fascist ideas would take hold, would in time lead Einstein into permanent exile. When one examines Einstein's reputation inside of Germany in the years after Eddington's verification of his theory, it reads at times like a morality play for the old adage that in his own country a prophet has no honor. Much of this had to do with the work, of hard right nationalists who seized on Einstein's Jewishness as a reason to attack both him and his ideas. We've already discussed the early controversies during the first years of the Weimar Republic, wherein men like Paul Weyland enlisted credible scientists like Ernst Gerke and Philipp Lenard in his crusade against Einstein, if such a term can be used, and the general theory of relativity. For their part, Gerke and Lenard probably did have legitimate scientific concerns about all of what might be thought of as modern physics, but they singled out relativity during this time. And I want to take just a moment or two to sort of examine what something like relativity must have been like for a physicist like Lenard. As we mentioned in previous episodes, Lenard harkened back to an older time in physics, before the distinction between theoretical and experimental physics really kind of emerged as a thing. He was a physicist, just a good old plain physicist, one that did good work in the lab and that could create and manipulate mathematical models of nature as long as they weren't too complicated. For him, that's what a physicist did, just as a chemist worked with various elements and their combinations and reactions to produce and understand various substances. As physics tried to, better understand the nature of matter, Lenard was one of the many talented physicists to use things like Crookes tubes or cathode ray tubes to uncover new phenomena. It would be for this work that he would be the second individual working at a German university and the first person from the Austro-Hungarian Empire to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on the photoelectric effect. Politically, like Planck and many others, he's what I would call an old world guy. He was most comfortable as a member of the old great empires, especially those with emperors in their capitals and eagles on their flags. When those empires all came crumbling down at the end of the Great War, Lenard, again like many others, must have had a significant sense of being a lost figure in a lost world. Now, in 1905, when Einstein's work on the photoelectric effect and relativity had been done from Switzerland, and in the former case built on Lenard's contributions, the jarring nature of jettisoning absolute space and time would have seemed pretty minor. Not a big deal, sort of strange, not sure, but, we can get along. However, by the time you get to 1919, with the Kaiserreich in ruins, the Habsburg lands being divided between various ethnic peoples, and republics rising up over autocracies, men like Lenard would have felt lost and adrift with all of the things that they saw as being solid and reliable in ruins. For Lenard and Gerke, the focus of their dislocation I should say, became Einstein and relativity for a variety of reasons. First, as we've mentioned, there was a conflating of relativity with its rejection of certain long-held absolutes with relativism, moral or otherwise. This, of course, is a completely incorrect equivalency, but it didn't stop that from actually happening, both in the press, especially the right-wing press, and among various artists, whether it be music or in literature or in visual art, who sort of understood that those rejection of absolutes in the theory of relativity would also impact and, reflect in their work. Second, in Germany, as the Weimar Republic struggled economically, at least at first, those on the right created the well-known stabbed-in-the-back theory that claimed that Germany had not lost the war, but rather had been sold out by a nefarious coalition of effete bourgeois intellectuals, Jews, and other non-Teutonic peoples. Einstein, turns out, it just, as you can probably tell, checked a lot of those boxes as a member of the scientific community who was, of course, a Jew, who had not supported the war effort from the beginning, and who had helped in a small way in establishing and supporting the Weimar democracy. For Lenard, Einstein represented everything he felt he had lost and everything he hated in what had come to replace what he had lost. From there, it didn't take a whole lot to get him to make the move to finding reasons in Einstein's post-fame behavior that supported his preconceived suppositions about what he would come to call Jewish physics, and from that to a position that he advocated for a Germany-based only kind of physics that he and men like him had done, a proper German or later Aryan physics. The point of this digression, I guess, is to try to see how a guy like Leonard, or Gerke, or later Johannes Stark, excellent scientists, well-educated intellectuals, solid citizens who were probably seen as strong members of the scientific community and all-around good guys, would end up leading the Nazi efforts to purify science in the Third Reich. They weren't, at least to begin with, out-and-out anti-Semites. But in time, and in response to support across many segments of Germany, those attitudes and ideas were encouraged and never truly rebutted by others in their community, by men like Planck or Haber, who could have been more publicly vocal in their disagreement, something they shared with Einstein in letters and conversations. One day, I'll probably do a biographical series on Planck, and in it, I'll spend a good deal of time unpacking the aristocratic German Dean of Science's ambivalence and silence in the face of the rise of right-wing German nationalism generally, and towards Hitler specifically, until it was way too late. As horrible as men like Leonard were, they would have remained fringe players in the unfolding drama had it not been for the acquiescence of more important voices like Planck, Nernst, Haber, and Heisenberg. But that's another story for another time, or perhaps it's newly relevant at a time when scientists and their work are more and more often being censored by political figures who are uncomfortable with the fact that the conclusions reached by the researchers threaten an older way of doing things. Things, of course, reached the first head in about 1922 with the assassination of Walther Rathenau, Germany's foreign minister, and then with Hitler's abortive uprising at the beer hall in Munich, wherein he sought to duplicate Mussolini's march on Rome. With Hitler's arrest and imprisonment, the whole temperature of just anti-right or anti-government right-wing sentiment began to cool, something aided by the fact that Einstein, himself at the top of some assassination lists, spent nearly 50% of the period between 1920 and 1925 outside the country on various scientific and Zionist tours. What is fascinating about these trips is that they allowed Einstein to act as a sort of de facto diplomatic emissary to formerly hostile powers in ways that couldn't be done through formal or traditional channels. Whether he was in America, England, France, or Japan, Einstein's personality, candor, and lack of nationalism allowed him to connect with important figures in each nation in a way that would begin building bridges that would allow Germany to eventually retake its place among the great powers. In each case, he seemed to know exactly the right note to strike or action to take to show his hosts that there were Germans who understood what was going on in the broader world and were willing to be a part of it, whether that be the laying of a wreath at the grave of Newton in Westminster Abbey or the visiting of cemeteries in northern France. Of that visit specifically, a French journalist wrote for his newspaper, quote, "Right here, where the wheat is sprouting, there are still traces of moldering trenches. This is the first cemetery, not laid out according to rank, but in rows next to each other, the French with their white crosses, the Germans with their black ones. Einstein takes off his hat. He is quite moved. In a soft voice full of melancholy tenderness, he talks about the war, the militarism he despises and has always hated. It is imperative, says Einstein, that we bring all the students of Germany here, now, students throughout the world, so that they may see how appalling war is." End quote. By 1925, with the help of financial assistance from the rest of the world, mainly though from the United States, Germany had gotten back on its feet and was not only the second leading industrial power in the world, but also a cultural center in the sciences and arts. In Berlin, a libertine ethos developed, one which Einstein supported and in which he, at least to a broad degree, participated. Much like the Roaring Twenties in the United States, this was a period of both flowering and indulgence among many in Germany, especially among the bourgeois. This is the age of Josephine Baker, Asta Nielsen, and Marlene Dietrich, of the coming of jazz and the launching of great airships. It's the time of cabaret and punch, where musical theater, burlesque, and political satire reached their heights, along with new movements in art, architecture, and literature. For his part, Einstein partook of the nightlife and was seen in the company of many of the most notable celebrities of the time. He was, in short, a bon vivant who wasn't embarrassed to be seen in the company of a woman who wasn't his wife, or to hear the whispers of what they might do together after leaving some low-rent dive club when the night grew long. And this carried on well enough until the global financial crash of 1929, and again, much like was the case in the United States, even after that crash, there was a certain willingness among those who still had money to continue to grasp at the bright lights and the lure of celebrity. However, as such things go, those who saw their jobs evaporate and whose savings were once again rendered worthless by the growing problem of first inflation and then hyperinflation, well, they were less willing to be forgiving of the government in Berlin. As had been the case earlier in Italy, those workers and farmers who no longer could make ends meet began to look for another solution. One among those who advocated a return to former German greatness in Teutonic ideals of militarism, autocracy, and racial purity. This time, however, rather than trying to achieve their ends through violent overthrow, the leaders of this movement took to legitimate political means and formed the German National Socialist Democratic Party, or Nazi Party, with the goal of gaining enough of a majority in the Reichstag to seize all power, and that would be, of course, an end they would achieve. In the same year that Einstein built his summer getaway in Kaputhe, the one place he would truly feel at home in his entire life, the Nazis began truly their climb to power. When he traveled for a second time to the United States, he was asked what he thought of Hitler. His response was one that suggested that he had yet to fully comprehend the danger the Nazis posed to the Republic he so strongly reported. He said, quote, "He is living on the empty stomach of Germany. As soon as economic conditions improve, he will no longer be important," end quote. However, when he returned to America in late 1931, he recognized his error and began to shift in his calls for pacifism. Understanding that Hitler and his ilk would push for rearmament and war, he began to suggest that to restrain the evil that Hitler was, men might have to be willing to take up arms in certain circumstances. It was also at about this time that he truly began to recognize that a Germany in the hands of the Nazis might not welcome him, and so he decided to seek a solution that would allow him to exit the country for a period of time as he saw fit or necessary, even though that was just a really difficult thing for him to do, and it put him sort of on the horns of a dilemma. Before I go any further, I'd like to read a quote from Jürgen Neffe's biography of Einstein that I think captures the difficulty Einstein had, not just at this point, but throughout his life, with his German heritage. It's a long quote, but I think it says really well why Einstein seemed to have such a difficult time leaving Germany, especially in this period. You know, it's something that he had come very close to doing back in 1923 when the assassination orders seemed to be out on him. And, in 1931 he began to make plans to do so again, but it would take him almost 2 years to get to that point. So here's what Neffe has to sort of say about that. He writes, quote, "Einstein, as a representative of Germany, of the good Germany to boot, seems quite surprising to us today. Only his deep-seated desire for freedom, which gained a ray of hope in the democratic spring of the Weimar Republic, gave his role a certain plausibility. It even seemed within the realm of possibility that people could get beyond the petit bourgeois conformism in liberal Berlin, which was an issue dear to his heart. If not for the narrow-minded chauvinists, the anti-Semites, the revanchists, and the reactionaries hell-bent for revenge, Einstein could have found something like a homeland in the very land of his birth. Germania was Einstein's femme fatale. If he came too close, he got burned, but he could not pull away either. His bête blonde had molded him into the person he was. She spoke his language, praised his diligence, shaped his thinking, told the jokes he enjoyed, understood what he said, cooked his favorite dishes, and felt his philosophy. She hated and loved him, and he hated her back as the inner demon he could never exorcise. His self-discipline, coupled with his occasional lack of self-control when dealing with supposedly weaker people, sometimes made him more German than he would have liked. On the other hand, he lacked the German traits of self-hatred and inferiority complex, overcompensated for by megalomania and Schadenfreude. Even before moving to Berlin, he judged the Germans rather harshly. He wrote, quote, "How coarse and primitive they appear. Vanity without real self-esteem. Civilization, meaning well-brushed teeth, elegant tie, well-groomed mustache, impeccable suit, but no personal culture. Coarseness of speech, movement, voice, feeling," end quote. On top of that, he returned to this country during a golden age of militarism, and one of his major reasons for having left Germany earlier had been his determination not to serve in the military. Einstein was revolted by drills and oppression, orders and blind obedience to authority, and masses of men in boots and uniforms all facing forward. Everything about soldiers was inimical to his nature. He could not imagine lusting for power and detested coercion and brutality based on military rank and epaulets as much as he worshipped the ideal of freedom, end quote. And so it was, as the Nazis rose to power, that he planned to leave, at least for a time. His hope was that he could find a position somewhere that would allow him to come and go as fitted him, a distinguished visiting professor sort of thing, that would enable him to return to his isolated cottage on the lake and see his friends whenever he felt he could, and still escape the unraveling political situation in Berlin as needed. That was the real purpose of that 1931 trip, to feel out the various possibilities, to see what might fit. At first, it seems as if he was leaning towards taking a position at another European university or at Oxford. But as he compared his experience in the United States to his time across the Atlantic, he found that he preferred the culture there. Now, to be clear, he was deeply conflicted about this, at least at first. While he admired the commitment to both democracy and individual freedom in the United States, he found the commercialism and materialism woven into everything off-putting. He was, at heart, a simple man with simple tastes, and the never-ending message of more, something pushed by the emergence of Madison Avenue and mass media advertising during this period, ran against that. In fact, it wasn't until Alfred Flexner suggested he considered joining his new project in Princeton, New Jersey, that Einstein began to really consider coming to the U.S. While Caltech was the type of institution he was looking for, at least initially, Albert Millikan's conservatism and the conservatism of those who supported the university rubbed Einstein, who preferred spending time with the much more liberal Charlie Chaplin and Upton Sinclair, completely the wrong way. In 1932, Flexner convinced Einstein to come to the Institute, and so he planned to do just that. Now, there's a story about the day when Albert and Elsa packed up the house on the lake in December of 1932 to travel to America and prepared to depart. As they locked the front door, began to walk to the car that would take them to the train, Albert is said to have turned to Elsa and said something to the effect, quote, "Take a very good look at it. You will never see it again," end quote. Held up as an example that Einstein knew that he wouldn't return to Germany, there are some serious questions about whether or not the story is true. It turns out that earlier in that year, Einstein had actually purchased the property next to the college on the lake and had written his old friend Solovine to send a set of papers to him there at the college in the next April. Not things that you would see someone who's planning to leave for the rest of his life actually do. Now, there are a couple of possible explanations here. One is that the story is one of those sort of apocryphal things that sort of seems to get attached to great figures like Einstein. And that's the view, by the way, of Jürgen Neffe in his biography. Another is that Einstein was sort of holding out hope that he'd be able to figure out a way to split time between the U.S. and Germany, maybe after a period of hiding out while the crest of the Nazi wave broke. He had sort of done that with his tours in that earlier crisis period, and so that may be what he's trying to do here. And that's what Walter Isaacson seems to think in his biography. For me, in my reading, though, I think the story is a true one, actually. I think that Einstein started out thinking he could do some half measures, But either out of a peak of despair or a sober realization that, like in Italy with Mussolini and in Hungary with the Black Hand, Hitler was a long-term thing who would lead Europe into another war, he realized that he wouldn't be coming back. 5 days after Einstein arrived in the United States, Hitler was elected as the Chancellor of Germany, and in short order, the Reichstag was burned to the ground, opposition political parties were outlawed, and in March, Germany's parliament ceded all authority to the executive branch in what's known as the Enabling Act. Just 1 month later, all Jews were banished from holding public positions in the government. And it's with this very dramatic and quick slide from what had been going on in the Weimar Republic to the establishment of what would become Nazi brutality that I think Einstein realized that the entire game was up. Just 5 days after the parliament that passed the Enabling Act was elected, while on a ship returning to Europe so that he could reside in Belgium, Einstein declared that he would never return to Germany. 2 weeks later, he resigned from the Prussian Academy, saving it the embarrassment of having to kick him out. The entire thing left Einstein bitter for much of the rest of his life as he felt, justifiably I think, that his supposed colleagues had not stood up for him in a time when standing up was needed. This was especially true for both Planck and Haber, both of whom would soon come to regret their decisions to remain silent earlier in Hitler's power grab. When the Nazis expelled all the Jews from holding public offices, including professorships in universities, Planck arranged a meeting with Hitler to argue against applying it to universities in general and physics in particular, saying that it would set German physics back immeasurably. To this, Hitler is said to have thundered back, "Then Germany will do without physics for a while." In the case of Haber, much more tragically, the Jew who had assimilated so long before, his service to the German Empire and the Republic meant little in the face of Nazi ideology. He would be unceremoniously stripped of his position and his institute in Berlin and would have to flee the country. When he heard of this, Einstein wrote Haber, quote, "I am delighted to know that your former love of the blonde beast has somewhat cooled off," end quote. Haber would not have long to rue his fate, as he would die of heart failure while in Basel in January of 1934. For his part, Einstein would work with both Rutherford and Eddington in England over that period in 1933 to raise money for those Jewish scientists in Germany who were now out of a job, as a way of helping them transition into positions in England and the United States. In fact, it was Einstein's own decision to immigrate to the U.S. that convinced many others to follow. Many of these refugees would lift the graduate schools across the United States to world-class status, training the next generation of American students and working in the 1940s on projects important to the war effort. Unlike our series on Heisenberg, who spent the years of Nazi rule actually in Germany, Einstein's departure means that we won't continue to track the developments there, and instead we'll follow him to the United States in our next episode. However, before we leave this topic, let me offer a bit more editorial content, if I may. I think that there is a great deal to be learned from studying the way different scientific figures dealt with the situation in Germany during the 1920s and early 1930s. While Einstein might be called naive for his positions on things like pacifism, economic policy, and social issues, I think it has to be noted that he had the courage of his convictions, even when those principles and ideas cost him friends, supporters, and in time, his material possessions. To repeat what I said earlier, in almost every case, perhaps excepting his pacifism, he came out on the right side of history. His positions on everything from homosexuality and same-sex marriage to civil rights for minorities have been adopted by nearly every democratic government in the world. His unwillingness to accommodate autocracy in any form after the fall of the Kaiserreich in 1918 would prefigure the position of men like Winston Churchill. Others, like Planck, Heisenberg, and Haber, have been more harshly judged by those who have examined their willingness to remain in Germany and lend their credibility to the Nazi regime there, not to mention men like Philipp Lenard and Johannes Stark, who slide into outright racism, forever tarnishes their scientific accomplishments. It is in this way, this knowing the stories of these men, that we can take lessons from history and applying them to our own lives and circumstances. There are those who say that those in the sciences should stick to what they know and do, and not meddle in the realms of politics and social issues. I think that there is, however, a responsibility of all members of a democracy to use those talents they have and skills they have developed to enter the public square and engage in the ongoing conversations there. Those conversations may be difficult and complex, but it is only through many voices do I think that meaningful solutions will be found. Moreover, when there are those who seek to silence others with whom they disagree, whether through attempting to shout them out of that public square or by restricting their ability to share their work and ideas, then those individuals must be resisted, both in the public square and at the ballot box. Anyway, those are my thoughts as I've worked through my research for this episode and for the episodes we did earlier on Heisenberg. If I've offended you, any of you, in any way, I hope you'll forgive me and know that I would welcome your feedback either through our Facebook page, on my Twitter feed, or in an email to me at cldavies@mac.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And I want you all to know that I truly appreciate that each of you take the time to listen to the show and support what we're doing here. I hope you'll also remember that we are beginning the Summer Odyssey, so if you are taking a journey and you want to share some science-related experiences, we'd love to see them. We'll have a few up on the website, or I should say up on our Facebook page, in just a few days. Next time, we'll look at the decade of Einstein's life up through the end of the Second World War and his role in initiating what would become the Manhattan Project. Until then, full sails on your journey.